November 13th, 1942. Guadalcanal. A Marine Corporal did something so unauthorized that 70 years later, the Corps still won't officially acknowledge it happened. 200 Japanese soldiers were charging through the jungle darkness toward Henderson Field. Between them and the airstrip stood Corporal Tony Stein, a .50 caliber machine gun, and one impossible problem. His weapon could fire 600 rounds per minute. It could punch through engine blocks at 500 yards. It was the most feared machine gun in the Pacific. But it had a fatal flaw. After 2 minutes of sustained fire, the barrel would literally destroy itself. The steel would warp, crack, or explode. Army manuals were crystal clear. Stop firing at 90 seconds or the weapon fails. Stein needed to fire for 10 minutes straight. What he did next violated every regulation in the technical manual. It was based on solid physics. It smelled absolutely terrible. And the military secretly tested it for years afterward. The Browning M 2.50 caliber machine gun earned its reputation for good reason. When John Moses Browning finalized the design in 1921, he created what military historians still call the most successful heavy machine gun in history. This weapon could punch through engine blocks at 500 yards, tear apart light armor, and send a half-inch diameter projectile screaming downrange at 2,910 feet per second. The psychological impact alone was devastating. Japanese soldiers called it the woodpecker of death because of its distinctive firing rhythm. By 1942, every American infantry company in the Pacific wanted as many of these monsters as they could get. But here's what the recruiting posters never mentioned. The M2 had a fatal flaw that every machine gunner learned to fear. The weapon could theoretically fire 450 to 600 rounds per minute, but in practice, you had maybe 90 to 120 seconds of sustained fire before the laws of physics turned your best friend into a useless hunk of metal. The problem wasn't ammunition. A well-supplied crew could keep feeding that beast for hours. The problem was heat. And it was a problem that could get you killed. Every time the M2's firing pin struck a primer, it ignited 240 grains of smokeless powder that generated approximately 18,000 foot-pounds of energy. Most of that energy propelled the bullet forward, but about 30% converted directly into thermal energy. With each round, the barrel absorbed roughly 5,400 foot-pounds of heat. Fire 100 rounds in rapid succession, and you're pumping 540,000 foot-pounds of thermal energy into a steel tube that weighs just 26 pounds. The math was simple and brutal. After 2 minutes of sustained fire, the barrel temperature climbed past 800 degrees Fahrenheit. Push it to 3 minutes, and you're flirting with 1,100 degrees. At 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit, the barrel steel began to lose its structural integrity. The Army Ordnance Department knew this. The technical manual issued to every M2 crew included explicit warnings printed in bold letters. Sustained fire exceeding 2 minutes will result in barrel failure. The consequences of ignoring this warning ranged from bad to catastrophic. Best case scenario, the barrel warped slightly and your accuracy went to hell. Bullets started keyholing, tumbling sideways through the air instead of flying true. Smart gunners watched their tracers religiously. When they started spiraling, you had maybe 20 seconds before serious problems began. Worst case, the barrel actually ruptured, sending shrapnel back into your face and rendering the weapon permanently disabled. Mid-range on the disaster scale, the headspace, that critical gap between the bolt face and the barrel, would expand from thermal deformation, causing rounds to detonate prematurely in the chamber. Gunsmiths called this a cook-off, and it could turn a controlled weapon into an uncontrolled one real fast. Marine Corps after-action reports from Guadalcanal documented 23 separate instances of M2 barrel failures during the first 3 months of fighting. 7 resulted in complete barrel ruptures. 4 caused serious injuries to gun crews. In one particularly grim incident on October 8, 1942, a cook-off killed a corporal from 1st Battalion 7th Marines when the runaway gun traversed on its mount and swept rounds across his own position. Standard doctrine addressed this limitation head-on. Every M2 position required a spare barrel and a crew trained in the barrel change procedure. Swap the barrel every 90 seconds, let the hot one cool for 20 minutes, and you could theoretically maintain fire indefinitely. The barrel change itself took about 30 to 45 seconds if your crew was good, maybe 60 seconds if you were working in the dark or under fire. But all of this assumed one critical thing: you had time to stop shooting. Guadalcanal in November 1942 was where the Empire of Japan came to test whether American forces could be driven back into the sea. The island, roughly 90 miles long and 25 miles wide, had become the focal point of the entire Pacific War after Marines landed there on August 7th. By November, the fighting had devolved into a brutal stalemate centered around Henderson Field, the only operational airstrip in the Solomon Islands. Whoever controlled that airstrip controlled the sky, and whoever controlled the sky would win the Pacific. The Marines had established a defensive perimeter around Henderson Field, but that perimeter was stretched thin, very thin. The 1st Marine Division had been fighting for 3 months straight, taking casualties daily, and reinforcements were arriving slower than men were falling. On the night of November 12th, intelligence reports indicated a major Japanese offensive was coming. They were right. What those reports failed to capture was the scale. This wasn't going to be a probing attack or a harassment mission. Imperial General Headquarters had committed the entire 38th Infantry Division, fresh troops from Japan, with orders to break through the American lines and retake Henderson Field at any cost. These weren't green troops. These men had combat experience in Manchuria and China. They knew what they were doing. Marine Corporal Tony Stein held a position on what the maps designated as Hill 132, though everyone called it Henderson Ridge. The ridge formed a natural barrier on the southern approach to the airfield, elevated about 50 feet above the surrounding jungle. Stein's M2.50 caliber was positioned to cover a draw, a natural corridor between 2 higher hills where the vegetation thinned out just enough to create a kill zone about 80 yards deep and 40 yards wide. Military analysts would later call it a textbook defensive position. Stein called it a death trap, because if the Japanese came through that draw in force, his 3-man gun crew would be the only thing stopping them from rolling up the entire right flank. The attack began at 02:30 hours on November 13th. No artillery preparation, no warning, just shapes moving in the darkness. Lots of them, advancing with the kind of discipline that comes from professional soldiers who've trained together for years. Stein's assistant gunner, Private Eddie Morrison, spotted them first through the darkness, estimating at least 200 men forming up in the tree line. Maybe more. They were carrying Bangalore torpedoes to breach the wire, scaling ladders to cross the defensive trenches, and enough small arms ammunition to sustain an assault for hours. This is where the math turned ugly. Standard defensive doctrine called for short, controlled bursts, 5 to 7 rounds, then pause to assess. Conserve ammunition, prevent barrel overheating, maintain weapon reliability. But Stein could see what was developing in front of him. This wasn't a situation where controlled bursts would cut it. The Japanese were massing for a human wave attack, the kind where they just kept coming regardless of casualties until they either broke through or ran out of men. If Stein fired in short bursts, enough Japanese soldiers would survive to cross the kill zone and overrun his position. Once they got past his gun, They'd be behind the defensive line with nothing but scattered rifle squads between them and the airfield. Stein ran the numbers in his head. He had 3 barrels. Following doctrine that gave him maybe 6 minutes of total firing time spread over 30 minutes of combat, accounting for barrel changes and cooling. His loader, Private First Class Jack Chen, had 12 ammunition cans stacked within arm's reach, 600 rounds ready to go, with runners standing by to bring more. The ammunition wasn't the problem. To stop an assault force of this size, coming in waves, Stein needed at least 8 to 10 minutes of sustained fire. He was at least 2 minutes short, probably 4 minutes short if things went badly. And things always went badly. Stein made his decision in about 5 seconds. What he did next violated every technical manual, every regulation, and every piece of official doctrine the Marine Corps had ever written about the M2 Browning. But it was based on solid thermodynamic principles that any machinist would understand. Anthony Peter Stein was 23 years old on November 13th, 1942, which made him one of the older men in his squad. He'd grown up in Dayton, Ohio, where his father worked as a tool and die maker at National Cash Register Company. Tony followed his father into machining, spending 3 years learning precision metalwork before the war started. That background mattered more than anyone realized at the time, because Stein understood machines at an intuitive level that most 23-year-olds didn't. He knew what metal did under stress. He'd seen steel warp from heat, watched tolerances shift as components expanded, and learned how to work within or around those limitations. When Stein enlisted in January 1942, the Marine Corps put him on the M2 specifically because of his mechanical aptitude. The weapons platoon sergeant took one look at his civilian work history and said, "You're on the 50. By November, he'd fired approximately 8,000 rounds through various M2s during training and combat. He knew the weapon's quirks, its strengths, and its limitations better than he knew his own rifle. Now, watching shapes multiply in the darkness, his mind was working through calculations that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with arithmetic. The solution came from his days at National Cash Register. The concept was evaporative cooling, the same physics that makes you feel cold when you step out of a swimming pool on a windy day. When liquid water converts to vapor, it absorbs an enormous amount of energy, approximately 540 calories per gram at sea level. This latent heat of vaporization is why sweating works as a cooling mechanism for your body, and why pouring water on hot pavement makes that sizzling sound. Apply liquid to a superheated metal surface, and you create an extremely efficient heat transfer mechanism. The liquid absorbs thermal energy from the metal, converts to steam, and carries that energy away into the atmosphere. Industrial machining operations had used liquid cooling for decades by 1942. Cutting tools, drill bits, and milling machines all operated with constant coolant flow to prevent thermal damage. Stein had seen what happened when coolant pumps failed. Tools overheated and failed within seconds. He'd also seen machinists jury-rig emergency cooling systems using whatever liquid was available. The problem with cooling an M2 barrel in combat was simple logistics. You needed a liquid. You needed it immediately available, and you needed a lot of it. Water was ideal from a thermodynamic standpoint, but water was precious on Guadalcanal. Canteens were for drinking, not wasting on weapons. Bring water cans up to a forward fighting position just for the purpose of cooling a gun barrel, and you'd be explaining yourself to every officer between here and division headquarters. Besides, in the middle of a night assault, you used what you had within arm's reach. What Stein had within arm's reach was urine. His own, Morrison's, Chen's, and that of any other Marine in the immediate area. Human urine is approximately 95% water, with the remaining 5% being dissolved urea, creatinine, uric acid, and various salts. From a heat transfer perspective, it's almost as effective as pure water. The dissolved solutes actually raise the boiling point slightly. Pure water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, while urine boils at around 214 to 215 degrees. But at barrel temperatures exceeding 1100 degrees, that 2-degree difference was irrelevant. The liquid would flash to steam regardless. The chemical composition did create some complications. Urea decomposes at high temperatures into ammonia and carbon dioxide, which meant the process would produce a distinctly unpleasant smell. The dissolved salts could theoretically leave residue deposits in the barrel. The uric acid might cause minor corrosion issues. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Today's problem was keeping the barrel cool enough to fire. Marine Corps regulations explicitly prohibited what Stein was about to do, though the specific wording was buried in Technical Manual TM 9-1052-13 under the section titled Unauthorized Cooling Methods. The manual stated, under no circumstances should gunners attempt to cool barrels using non-approved liquids, including seawater, alcohol, petroleum products, or bodily fluids. Stein didn't care about regulations. He cared about math, physics, and the 200 Japanese soldiers who were about to rush his position. The first burst went out at 02:37 hours, 35 rounds that cut through the lead Japanese section like a saw through bamboo. Stein worked the trigger in controlled patterns, letting muscle memory guide the traversing and elevation controls while his mind tracked a different problem. He had maybe 90 seconds before the first barrel change. Morrison already had one of the empty ammo cans positioned next to the gun, and both he and Chen knew what was about to happen because Stein had explained it in about 15 seconds of whispered instructions that probably violated 3 or 4 articles of military justice. The Japanese kept coming. They had to. Once you commit to a night assault, there's no calling it off halfway. The second wave was already moving before the first wave's survivors hit the dirt. Stein put another 40 rounds into the mass of advancing soldiers, walking the fire from left to right across the kill zone. The muzzle flash lit up the night like a strobe light, destroying his night vision but illuminating targets with perfect clarity for half-second intervals. He could see faces. Young faces. Determined faces. Terrified faces. He kept firing. At 92 seconds, the barrel was approaching critical temperature. Stein could feel the heat radiating from the weapon. The tracers were starting to spiral slightly, that telltale sign that the rifling was losing its grip on the bullets. He yelled, "Barrel!" over the gun's hammering. Morrison already had his hands on the barrel release mechanism. He'd practiced this about 1,000 times. He did it in 12 seconds, pulling the glowing barrel free. Chen was ready with the ammo can, not the full one, the empty one. Stein grabbed the hot barrel from Morrison, held it horizontal, and Chen poured the contents directly onto the steel. The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. The liquid hit metal that was somewhere north of 1000 degrees Fahrenheit and converted to steam so fast it created a sound like a pressure cooker venting. The cloud of vapor that erupted from the barrel was thick, white, and smelled exactly like you'd expect. Stein rotated the barrel, letting Chen hit every side, ensuring even cooling. The entire process took maybe 8 seconds. Steam was still rising from the barrel when Morrison slammed the fresh barrel into place and locked it down. Total weapon downtime, 20 seconds. Stein was back on the trigger, firing into the second wave that had used those 20 seconds to get 15 yards closer. He burned through another 80 rounds, watching the Japanese ranks thin but not break. They were committed. Command had probably told them this was the breakthrough attack, the one that would retake Henderson Field and change the course of the war. They believed it enough to keep coming. The smell was atrocious. Ammonia from the decomposing urea mixed with cordite smoke and the metallic tang of vaporized steel, creating an atmosphere that would make you gag if you weren't too busy trying to stay alive. Stein's eyes were watering, partly from the chemical assault on his sinuses and partly from the smoke and muzzle flash. He didn't care. The gun was still firing, still putting rounds on target, and that was literally the only thing that mattered. At 4 minutes into the engagement, Stein was on his second barrel change. The first cooled barrel had been sitting for 3 minutes and was ready to go back into service. Chen hit it with another round of liquid cooling as insurance, producing another cloud of steam that briefly obscured the entire gun position. The Japanese must have seen those steam clouds and wondered what kind of weapon the Americans had deployed. The engagement lasted 9 minutes and 40 seconds from first shot to last. Stein fired 847 rounds total, rotating through his 3 barrels 4 complete cycles, with Chen performing emergency cooling on each barrel twice. The gun never jammed, never misfired, never failed. When the last Japanese soldier either fell or retreated back into the jungle darkness, Stein's hands were shaking so badly he couldn't light a cigarette. Morrison had to do it for him. The sun came up 6 hours later and revealed what they'd done. Bodies were stacked in overlapping rows across the kill zone, thickest at about 40 yards out, where the second and third waves had collided with the first wave's casualties. The Division Graves registration unit spent 2 days cataloguing the dead in front of Stein's position. Official count, 73 confirmed enemy KIA directly attributable to the M2 position on Henderson Ridge. Another 15 to 20 probable kills where blood trails led back into the jungle, but no bodies were recovered. Captured Japanese soldiers from the 38th Division later reported that their officers had specifically identified Stein's gun position as the breakthrough point, expecting to overwhelm it through sheer numbers. They'd been wrong. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, commanding 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, walked the position at 0800 hours. Puller was already a legend in the Corps, 2 Navy Crosses, a reputation for being absolutely fearless, and a command style that mixed professionalism with a complete disregard for anything that didn't win battles. He looked at the body count, looked at Stein's gun, then looked at the empty ammo cans sitting next to the position. One of them still had liquid pooled in the bottom. Puller stuck his finger in it, sniffed it, and his face remained completely neutral. "Corporal, what in the name of God is this?" Stein told him. "All of it. The thermal calculations, the evaporative cooling principle, the emergency barrel cooling procedure that had kept the gun firing for nearly 10 minutes straight." Puller listened while Morrison and Chen stood at attention, expecting to be arrested on the spot. When Stein finished, Puller walked over to the M2, ran his hand along the barrel that was still mounted in the weapon, and noticed something interesting. The barrel showed discoloration and some surface staining, but no warping, no structural damage, no signs of the catastrophic failure that should have occurred. Puller submitted a commendation report citing extraordinary initiative and technical innovation under combat conditions. But the Marine Corps was also institutionally horrified. Within a week, Stein was summoned to division headquarters to demonstrate his cooling technique for a panel that included 2 lieutenant colonels from Ordnance and a major from the Judge Advocate General's office. The JAG officer made it very clear that unauthorized modifications to weapons procedures violated Article 92 of the Articles of War, failure to obey lawful orders or regulations. The penalty ranged from reduction in rank to dishonorable discharge, depending on circumstances and command discretion. The ordnance officers, however, wanted details. They brought a demonstration M2, a chronograph to measure muzzle velocity, and enough ammunition to run actual tests. They made Stein repeat his cooling procedure 6 times while they measured barrel temperature, timing, and effectiveness. The test results from that November 1942 demonstration were classified as restricted and filed in Ordnance Report 0421-1173, which wasn't declassified until 1967. What those tests revealed contradicted 20 years of accepted doctrine about barrel cooling. The ordnance officers measured barrel temperature before and after Stein's liquid cooling method using thermocouple probes. A barrel at 1,150 degrees Fahrenheit dropped to 680 degrees in approximately 15 seconds when treated with Stein's technique. Air cooling that same barrel from 1,150 to 680 degrees required 7 minutes and 20 seconds. The liquid cooling method was roughly 29 times faster. The chemical analysis was mixed. Yes, the urea decomposition created ammonia vapor that was unpleasant and potentially hazardous in enclosed spaces. Yes, the dissolved salts left microscopic deposits in the barrel that could theoretically affect accuracy after repeated applications. But the barrels didn't warp, didn't crack, didn't fail structurally. The rapid temperature drop created thermal shock, sudden contraction of the steel, but the chromium molybdenum steel proved resilient enough to handle it. After 6 cooling cycles, the test barrel showed 0.003 inches of measurable wear beyond normal firing wear, which was within acceptable tolerances. The Marine Corps faced an institutional dilemma. They couldn't officially endorse urinating on machine guns. The optics were terrible. The health concerns were real. And imagine trying to explain that procedure to Congress during appropriations hearings. But they also couldn't ignore results. The solution was typically bureaucratic. They didn't approve it, but they didn't court-martial anyone either. The incident was quietly noted in training materials as an example of unauthorized field modifications that, while effective in specific circumstances, remain prohibited under standard operating procedures. What changed was the doctrine around spare barrels and barrel changing. Pre-Guadalcanal, most M2 positions carried 1 spare barrel. Post-Guadalcanal, the standard increased to 2 spares minimum, 3 when logistics allowed. The emphasis on barrel changing speed increased dramatically. Training cycles that previously allocated 2 hours to barrel changing drills expanded to 8 hours. Marines practiced barrel changes blindfolded, in gas masks, under simulated fire until they could execute the procedure in under 20 seconds consistently. The post-war development of quick-change barrel systems owed a direct debt to incidents like Stein's. The M2HB model that entered service in 1945 featured an improved barrel release mechanism that reduced change time from 30 to 45 seconds down to 15 to 20 seconds. The M60 machine gun, introduced in 1957, was designed from the ground up with quick barrel changes as a primary requirement. Average change time, 8 seconds with a trained crew. The M240 and M249 systems that followed built on this doctrine, treating the barrel as a consumable component that crews would swap multiple times per engagement. Military research into barrel cooling continued through the Cold War. Aberdeen Proving Ground ran classified tests in 1954, exploring various emergency cooling methods, including water, oil, compressed air, and yes, urine. The results confirmed Stein's empirical findings. Liquid cooling worked, it worked fast, and it didn't destroy the barrel. The tests also explored using pre-positioned water containers at defensive positions specifically for barrel cooling, a practice that became standard in Vietnam-era doctrine. But what happened to Tony Stein? He survived Guadalcanal and fought through the rest of the Pacific campaign. He earned a battlefield commission to second lieutenant at Bougainville in 1943. He survived the Hell of Peleliu in 1944, and he landed with the 5th Marine Division at Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945. On that black sand beach, Stein led 8 separate charges against Japanese pillboxes, personally destroying 4 enemy positions and evacuating wounded Marines under fire. He was armed with a custom weapon his unit called the Stinger, a modified aircraft machine gun he'd personally adapted for ground combat. On the 3rd day of the battle, Stein was killed by sniper fire while leading another assault. President Harry Truman awarded him the Medal of Honor posthumously. The citation mentioned his extraordinary heroism and conspicuous gallantry. It detailed his actions on Iwo Jima, the 8 charges, the 4 pillboxes destroyed, the wounded men saved. But it didn't mention Henderson Ridge, or the night he kept a gun firing for 10 minutes straight using nothing but physics, desperation, and available liquids. The M2 Browning he used that night in November 1942 was serial number 324775. It survived the war, served in Korea, and was finally retired from active service in 1968 after firing an estimated 400,000 rounds. It now sits in the National Museum of the Marine Corps at Quantico, Virginia. The placard doesn't mention the cooling trick. Some stories the Corps prefers to keep among Marines who understand that winning battles sometimes requires breaking rules that weren't written for the specific kind of hell you're facing. The official history books will tell you about Henderson Field, about the desperate fighting in November 1942, about how the Marines held against overwhelming odds. They'll mention the Medal of Honor recipients, the strategic importance of the airstrip, the turning point in the Pacific War. What they won't tell you is that on one ridge, on one night, a 23-year-old machinist from Dayton, Ohio, solved an impossible math problem using thermodynamics, 3 gun barrels, and the most readily available liquid in a foxhole. The men who held Henderson Ridge that November night knew the truth. Sometimes innovation smells bad, violates regulations, and saves lives anyway. That's not in any manual, but it should be. The story of Tony Stein and Henderson Ridge represents something the military has always struggled to acknowledge, that the difference between victory and defeat sometimes comes down to a single soldier willing to ignore every rule in the book because the situation demands it. The Marine Corps never officially approved Stein's cooling method. They couldn't. Imagine the training videos. Imagine the equipment requisition forms. Imagine trying to maintain any semblance of military discipline when you've just told thousands of young men that urinating on their weapons is acceptable field procedure. But they tested it, repeatedly, secretly, for years, and quietly, without fanfare or official announcements, they changed everything about how machine gunners were trained and equipped. More spare barrels, faster change procedures, pre-positioned cooling water, emergency cooling protocols that the technical manuals describe in carefully sanitized language that never quite explains where the doctrine came from. The engineers who designed the M60, the M240, the M249, they knew. The instructors at weapons school who drilled barrel changes until Marines could do them in their sleep, they knew. The ordnance officers who wrote the classified reports that gathered dust in Aberdeen Proving Grounds archives, they definitely knew. But Tony Stein never knew what his improvisation would become. He died on Iwo Jima at age 26, having spent exactly 3 years in the Marine Corps. His Medal of Honor citation runs 247 words and describes extraordinary valor under fire. It doesn't mention the most important lesson he taught the Corps, that survival in combat often requires choosing between what the manual says and what physics demands. That sometimes the right answer isn't in any regulation or technical order. That innovation in warfare doesn't always come from laboratories or proving grounds. Sometimes it comes from a foxhole at 2300 hours when the math doesn't work and you've got 5 seconds to figure out a solution. The gun is in the museum. The story remains mostly untold, the doctrine quietly changed, and somewhere, in training courses and field manuals, and the institutional memory of the Corps, the lesson survived. When the book doesn't have an answer for the hell you're facing, sometimes you have to write a new page, even if that page smells terrible and will never be officially published.